Have you ever heard of the legendary samurai warriors of Japan? Well, imagine a country where they fought for over 100 years. Now imagine that same country just shutting its doors to the entire world for more than 2 centuries, creating this totally unique world of its own. And then, almost overnight, it transforms into one of the most modern nations on the planet. It sounds like something out of a movie, right? But it's a true story, and it's the one we're diving into today. Japan's incredible journey from war to peace, and from total isolation to a modern powerhouse?
So, here's our roadmap for this amazing story. First, we're gonna see how Japan finally put an end to its super long period of war. Then, we'll step inside this peaceful, lockdown Japan and see what life was actually like. We'll look at why they closed their doors in the first place and what happened when some very powerful outsiders came knocking. Then we'll witness the last battles that brought the Age of the Samurai to a close, and finally, we'll see how Japan took a giant leap into the modern world. Ready? Let's get started.
Alright, so let's set the scene. Our story begins in a really chaotic and dangerous time in Japan's history. You see, before this long period of peace, there was a very, very long war. The country wasn't really one nation at all, but a bunch of fighting pieces. And for everyday people, life was completely unpredictable.
Yeah, for more than a century, Japan was not a peaceful place. This time was known as the Sengoku period, which basically means the country at war. You had these powerful warlords called daimyo, and they were kind of like kings of their own little territories. They were all constantly fighting each other, trying to grab more land and more power. And these endless wars really left the country shattered.
So, after all this fighting, one warlord, a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu, finally came out on top. He was the strongest. He won the last big battles and managed to unite the whole country. Now, Japan had an emperor who was a very respected figure, but he didn't have a lot of real power. So the emperor gave Ieyasu the title of Shogun. The best way to think about it is like this. The emperor was like a king or queen today, a symbol of the country, but the shogun was like the prime minister with a massive army. He was the one who was really in charge.
So, in the year 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu set up his own government, which we call the Tokugawa Shogunate, and this was a huge turning point. This moment marked the end of all the wars and the beginning of an incredible 250 years of peace. This peaceful era is known as the Edo Period, named after the new capital city, Edo, which you might know by its modern name, Tokyo.
Okay, so Japan finally had peace. That's great. But how on earth did the shogun make it last for 2.5 centuries, especially after 100 years of non-stop fighting? Well, the answer was a very clever and very strict system of rules that controlled pretty much everyone and everything in society.
To keep order, society was split into this really rigid 4-class system. As you can see, at the very top you had the samurai. They were the warriors who had fought the wars, and now they were the rulers and the government officials. But right below them, and this might surprise you, were the farmers. Now, why were they ranked so high? Because they produced rice, the most important thing in Japan. It wasn't just food, it was basically used like money. Below the farmers, you had the artisans, the skilled craftspeople who made things like swords, clothes, and pottery. And way down at the very bottom of the system, the merchants.
This quote really explains the wild idea behind this whole system. Your social rank wasn't based on how rich you were. In fact, merchants were often the wealthiest people around, but they were still at the bottom of the ladder. So why? Because the system was based on what you produced for society. Farmers made food, artisans made useful things, but merchants, they didn't make anything. They just bought and sold stuff that other people made. In the government's eyes, this made them less morally pure. It was a society that valued making things over making money.
The shogun also had to control those powerful daimyo, the regional lords we talked about, to make sure they never tried to start another war. And he came up with a genius plan to do it. First, every daimyo had to spend every other year living in the capital city, Edo. But second, and this is the really clever part, their families had to live in Edo all the time. This meant their families were essentially hostages, which guaranteed the daimyo would stay loyal. On top of that, having to keep up 2 giant homes and travel back and forth was crazy expensive, which meant the lords never had enough money to raise an army to challenge the shogun.
But just controlling society from the inside wasn't quite enough. To truly lock in that stability, the shogun believed he had to cut Japan off completely from what he saw as dangerous ideas and influences from the outside world.
This policy was called Sakoku, which literally means closed country. And they weren't kidding. For over 200 years, Japan was almost completely locked down. Foreigners were banned from coming in, and Japanese people were banned from leaving. If you left, you could actually be executed if you try to come back. The shogunate was especially terrified of Christian missionaries from Europe. They worried that this new religion would teach people to be loyal to a foreign god instead of the shogun, and that could spark a rebellion and tear down their perfect social order.
Now, this long piece was a real double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a golden age for Japanese culture. You had amazing art forms like woodblock prints, and kabuki theater become super popular. But on the other hand, there was a huge problem brewing. While Japan was basically in its own little time capsule, the rest of the world was changing fast. Countries in the West were having the Industrial Revolution, inventing steam engines, building factories, and creating powerful new weapons. Japan, with its doors slammed shut, was missing all of it and falling way, way behind.
And that technology gap was about to become painfully obvious. Japan's peaceful little bubble couldn't last forever. The outside world was about to come knocking, and they weren't going to be polite about it. The year is 1853, and this is the moment. This is when everything changes. After more than 200 years of quiet isolation, Japan's world is about to be turned upside down by a fleet of powerful ships that just appeared on the horizon without any warning.
The visitor was an American naval officer, Commodore Matthew Perry. And he didn't exactly come alone. He sailed right into Edo Bay with a squadron of 4 American warships.
I mean, try to imagine seeing these for the first time. The Japanese had only ever known wooden sailing ships. These things were huge, they were black, they were powered by steam engines that belched out thick black smoke. The Japanese called them the Kurofune, which means the black ships, and they were armed with massive cannons, way more advanced than anything Japan had. What Perry was doing is something called gunboat diplomacy. It's pretty simple. You show up with your powerful warships and use the threat of force to get exactly what you want.
Perry's message was blunt, and it was not a friendly request. He had a letter from the US president demanding that Japan open its ports to American ships for trade. And the threat was obvious. Either you agree, or these powerful ships are going to be used against you. Faced with this overwhelming military technology, the shogun's government had no real choice. They had to agree. And just like that, over 200 years of isolation was over.
You can imagine being forced to open the country like this was a huge embarrassment for the shogun's government. Their whole job was to protect Japan, and they've been totally powerless against the American ships. This made the shogunate look incredibly weak to its own people, especially the proud samurai. And this feeling of weakness created a deep crack in the country, one that would eventually explode into another civil war.
So the country basically split in two. On one side, you had forces who were loyal to the shogun. They wanted to keep the current government and figure out a way to deal with these new foreigners. But on the other side, you had powerful samurai and lords who felt the shogun had completely failed Japan. Their goal was to get rid of the shogun, give all the power back to the emperor, who they saw as the true leader of Japan, and kick the foreigners out.
The civil war that followed, called the Boshin War, was pretty short, but it was decisive. The imperial forces, who had more modern tactics and a stronger sense of purpose, defeated the shogun's army. The last shogun surrendered in 1868, ending more than 250 years of Tokugawa rule, and, really, signaling the end of the entire samurai era. Power was officially handed back to the emperor.
With the young Emperor Meiji now officially in charge, Japan's new leaders faced a terrifying reality. They had seen firsthand what the West's technology could do, and they knew they had a choice: modernize and do it fast, or risk being taken over by a Western power, just like so many other countries in Asia.
What happened next is one of the fastest, most incredible transformations any country has ever gone through. It's called the Meiji Restoration. And just look at this timeline to see how crazy fast it all was. In 1868, the shogun is out. Just 3 years later, in 1871, the entire old feudal system is gone. Poof. 2 years after that, they have a modern national army where any man could be a soldier, not just samurai. And by 1889, that's only 21 years from the start, they have a modern, Western-style constitution. They literally tore down their old world and built a new one at lightning speed.
So the big takeaway here is that everything changed. The special samurai class was completely abolished. They created a new government modeled after countries in Europe. They started building factories, railroads, and telegraph lines to connect the whole country. They launched a new public school system for all kids, and maybe most importantly for their survival, they built a powerful new army and navy by copying the best ideas from the West.
And this brings us to our final question. And it's a really interesting one to think about. It's easy to look at the Edo period and think of it as backward or stuck in the past. But consider this: that long peace created a very stable, highly organized society. They had a high literacy rate and a strong, unified national culture. So did that very stability and order, the one created by the shoguns, actually give Japan the perfect foundation it needed to make that amazing, record-breaking jump into the modern world? It's a fascinating thought to end on.
I want to start today with a mental image. I think it's one that pretty much everyone has no matter where you're from.
Okay, I'm with you.
I want you to picture a samurai. Just close your eyes and picture one. What do you see?
Okay, yeah. I see the armor.
Yeah.
Definitely the armor, the lacquered plates, the whole thing. Maybe a helmet with, like, big horns or something dramatic.
Right, the helmet.
And, of course, the sword, the katana.
Yeah.
It's probably the most important part of the image. He's maybe on a horse, charging into a battle, screaming. It's the ultimate warrior.
Yeah, it's exactly the image. It's what pop culture has given us for decades. But here's the hook for our deep dive today, and it's a massive one.
Mm-hmm.
What if I told you that for the vast majority of the time that the samurai existed as this powerful class, we're talking over 250 years, they almost never, ever fought in a war?
It just sounds wrong.
Right.
It's a complete contradiction. It's like saying, imagine a professional athlete. They train every day, they wear the uniform, they know all the plays, but the league has just canceled the season. Forever.
That is the perfect analogy, and that's exactly what we are unpacking today. We're looking at the Edo period in Japan, and the central question is really, it's a human one. What does a warrior class do when there are no wars to fight?
How do you even define yourself when your entire job description, which is, let's be honest, fighting and killing people for your lord, is suddenly, well, not needed and mostly illegal?
It's this incredible sociological experiment, and the setting for it is the Edo period. That runs from 1603 all the way to 1868. It's also called the Pax Tokugawa.
Yeah, the great Tokugawa peace.
Let's break those words down just so we're all on the same page. Pax is Latin for peace. Easy enough. And Tokugawa.
Tokugawa is the family name of the rulers, the shoguns.
Yeah.
Before 1603, you have to understand, Japan was, well, it was a mess. It was the Sengoku period.
The Warring States period?
Exactly. Imagine the whole country just shattered into dozens of little pieces, and each piece is run by a warlord, a daimyo, who's constantly fighting his neighbors for more land. It was just a century of non-stop, brutal civil war.
And then one man comes along and basically ends it all. Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Right, he was an absolute strategic genius. He manages to defeat all his rivals in a huge battle, the Battle of Sekigahara, and unifies the country under his rule. He establishes the shogunate in 1603.
Okay, so we need to define the key players here, because the political structure of Japan at this time can be a little confusing if you're not used to it.
It can, yeah.
You got an emperor and you've got a shogun. In like a modern sense, how do we tell them apart? Who's actually in charge?
The best way to think about it is maybe like a constitutional monarchy, but with a military government running the show. The emperor lived in Kyoto.
Okay.
He was seen as a descendant of the sun goddess, a huge religious figure. He was the spiritual heart of Japan, the ultimate symbol, but he had almost zero real political power.
So he couldn't pass laws or command armies or anything like that?
Nothing. He was a figurehead. Think of, the modern British monarchy. Lots of prestige, lots of ceremony. But the king isn't running the government day to day.
That makes sense. So he's the symbolic leader. The real power then was with the shogun.
Precisely. The shogun was the head of the military government, the bakufu. He lived in a brand new city called Edo, which we now call Tokyo. He was the one calling all the shots, making the laws, collecting the taxes. He was, for all intents and purposes, the military dictator of Japan.
Okay, so shogun is the big boss. Who works for him?
Underneath the shogun, you have the daimyo. These were those powerful feudal lords we mentioned from the Civil War period. Think of them as, like governors of very large states.
So they still had their own territories.
Oh, yeah. They ruled their own domains, which were called Han. They had their own castles, their own local governments, their own samurai. But, and this is the key, they ultimately had to swear loyalty and answer to the shogun in Edo.
And serving these daimyo, that's where our guys come in.
That's where the samurai come in. They were the retainers. The word samurai itself actually comes from an old verb, saburo, which means to serve. They were the administrators, the army, and the personal staff for the daimyo.
So we've got the hierarchy, shogun at the top, daimyo below him, and samurai serving the daimyo. Tokugawa Ieyasu wins the war, becomes shogun, and basically says to everyone, all right, party's over, put down your swords, we're done fighting now.
And he was serious. He basically locked the country down, he closed the borders to almost all foreigners, and crucially, he locked the social structure in place. Which brings us to this class system. You really can't understand the Edo period without understanding this.
This is the Shinyu system, right?
That's the one. It was based on ideas from Confucianism, the philosophy from China.
And Confucianism is all about order and harmony and everyone knowing their place in society.
Exactly. So the shogunate created this rigid, four-tiered class system. It was basically a caste system. You were born into your class, and you died in that class. There was almost no moving up or down.
Let's climb that ladder. Who's at the very, very top?
At the top, you have the shi. That's the samurai.
The warriors.
The warrior rulers.
Right.
Even with no war, they were seen as the moral and political leaders. They were a tiny fraction of the population, maybe 6 or 7%, but they held all the power. They were the government.
Okay, so the guys with the swords are number one. That makes sense. Who's number two? This is where it gets weird for us today.
It really does.
Yeah.
Number two were the nook, the farmers.
Farmers. Peasants. They were ranked higher than like a skilled craftsman or a rich business owner.
Way higher. And this is pure Confucian logic. The idea was that farmers produced the most essential thing. They grew the rice that fed the entire nation. Their work was seen as fundamentally virtuous and necessary. Without them, everyone starves.
Right. It's not about money. It's a value judgment on their contribution to society.
Exactly. So number three on the ladder were the ko, the artisans. These are your blacksmiths, your weavers, your carpenters, your potters, people who make things.
So they're useful. They take raw materials and turn them into goods.
Right. They're respected, but they're seen as less essential than the farmers because they're not producing the food itself.
And that leaves the bottom rung.
At the very bottom, you have the sho, the merchants.
The shopkeepers, the traders, the bankers.
All of them. The people who handle the money.
Why were they at the bottom? I mean, today they'd be at the top.
Because in this worldview, they were seen as parasitic.
Wow, strong word.
Yeah. The thinking was they don't grow the rice, they don't weave the cloth, they don't forge the tools, they just move something from person A to person B and take a profit in the middle. The samurai especially looked down on them, saw them as people getting rich off the labor of others without creating anything tangible themselves.
That's such a fascinating cultural difference. Today we celebrate entrepreneurs and the people who run the market.
It's the complete opposite of modern capitalism. In Edo, Japan, profit for its own sake was considered, well, dirty.
Now, were there any people outside this four-part system?
Yes, on both ends. Above the whole system, you had the emperor and his court nobles in Kyoto. They were kind of in their own bubble, too holy and ancient to be on the ladder. And then, sadly, below the system, you had the outcasts.
The Eida and Hanin.
Yeah. They were people who were forced to do jobs that were considered unclean in Buddhist and Shinto beliefs. Things like tanning leather, butchering animals, handling the dead. They faced horrific discrimination and were forced to live in their own segregated villages.
And it's so important to remember this wasn't just like a social suggestion. The government enforced the system with an iron fist. I was reading about the sumptuary laws.
Oh, the sumptuary laws are wild. The shogunate was obsessed with making sure you could tell someone's class just by looking at them from 50 feet away. It was all about visual control and keeping everyone in their box.
Give us some examples.
Okay, clothing was the big one. Silk was, by law, reserved for the samurai class. If you were a farmer, even an incredibly wealthy farmer, you were legally forbidden from wearing a silk kimono.
What could they wear?
Simple stuff. Cotton, hemp, linen, and you could only wear certain colors. Mostly dull ones like indigo blue or brown. Bright, flashy patterns. That was for the upper class.
So if a merchant got super rich and decided to wear a fancy silk robe in public?
He could be arrested.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There are stories of merchants who would wear like a plain cotton robe on the outside, but have it lined with the most expensive, beautiful silk on the inside, just so they could feel that luxury without being seen.
That's amazing. And it applied to more than just clothes, right?
Oh, everything. Your house, for example.
Yeah.
The size of your front gate was regulated by rank. The type of roof tiles you could use, whether you could have a second story, it was all spelled out.
All to make sure nobody gets any big ideas.
Exactly. And of course, the ultimate status symbol, the swords, the big and small. Only a samurai was allowed to wear 2 swords tucked into their belt. The long sword, the katana, and the shorter companion sword, the wakizashi. This was their badge of office. It wasn't just a weapon in this era, it was their soul, their identity. If you saw a man walking down the street with 2 swords, you knew who was in charge and you got out of the way.
So, okay, we have this class, the samurai. They are sitting at the very top of this rigid pyramid. They've got the silk clothes, the special houses, the swords, all the respect. But, as we established right at the beginning, they have no wars to fight.
And this leads to the single biggest career pivot in history. I mean, imagine an entire army of elite soldiers being told, okay, your new job is accounting.
From warriors to bureaucrats?
That's it. The shogunate didn't need an army to fight other Japanese people anymore. What it needed was a government to run the country. It needed tax collectors, magistrates, estate managers, judges, clerks, record keepers.
And who else are you going to get to do that? The samurai are the only educated class with any authority.
Exactly. So the samurai had to learn to read, write, and do mathematics with an abacus. They developed this new ideal called bunbu.
Bun and bu. What does that translate to?
Bun is the literary arts, the pen. Bud is the military arts, the sword. The ideal samurai in the Edo period had to master both ways. Bunbu Ryujutsu's the two ways of pen and sword. You couldn't just be a tough guy who could swing a sword anymore. You had to be an educated, literate administrator. You had to know Confucian philosophy and legal codes.
It's like the idea of the scholar warrior.
It is. But you have to imagine the psychological whiplash. You've been raised on glorious stories of your grandfather charging into battle, taking heads, winning land for his lord, and what's your job? Sitting at a desk, calculating how many bales of rice the village of Omoshiro produced this harvest. It must have been a bit of a letdown.
But they did still perform a security role, right? They weren't all just pushing paper.
Oh, absolutely. They were the police force, especially in the big cities like Edo and Osaka. But even here, the whole style of combat changed dramatically. This is one of my favorite details about the era.
Go on.
Because it was a time of peace, the primary goal of the police wasn't to kill criminals. It was to capture them alive and bring them to trial.
Which is pretty hard to do with a razor-sharp katana.
Exactly. One wrong move with a katana and the suspect is dead. So the samurai police developed this whole arsenal of amazing non-lethal weapons. They're collectively called the Torimono Sandugu, the 3 tools of arresting.
Okay, describe these for us, because the engineering is just so clever.
They're all basically long poles with different metal things on the end. The whole point is to control a violent person from a safe distance so you don't get stabbed or cut.
Smart.
So first you've got the sotagarami. That means sleeve entangler.
Sleeve entangler? How does that work?
You have to remember, everyone wore kimonos with these big flowing sleeves. The head of the sotagarami was this cluster of sharp, backward-facing hooks and barbs. The police officer would thrust it at a suspect, twist it, and the hooks would just snag and get tangled in the fabric of their sleeve.
Oh, I see.
Once it's tangled up, you can pull them off balance, drag them to the ground, and control their arm without ever actually piercing their skin. It's brilliant.
That is really smart. Okay, what's number 2?
Then you have the sasumata. This one looks kind of like a giant 2-pronged fork or a crescent moon on a pole. It wasn't for stabbing. It was used to pin a person. You could catch their neck, an arm, or a leg in the fork and just pin them against the wall or to the ground. It keeps the criminal about 6 feet away from you while they struggle.
And the third one?
The third is the tsukubu, which was basically a T-shaped push-pole. The head was covered in little spikes and hooks, again, to grip clothing. You'd use it to trip a suspect or push them down or just keep them at bay. So you can imagine a team of samurai police surrounding one guy with these long poles, tangling him, pinning him, pushing him, all without drawing their sword.
It's a completely different kind of martial art. And didn't they have a special kind of baton, too?
Yes. The jit. This is super famous in Japanese police dramas even today. It's a short, solid iron truncheon, maybe 1.5 feet long, and it's not sharp. The key feature is a little hook, or a guard, sticking out to the side near the handle.
What was the hook for?
A skilled user could use that hook to block an incoming sword attack. They could actually catch the blade of a katana in that hook, and with a flick of the wrist, disarm the attacker or even snap the blade. It became the symbol of police authority, like a modern police officer's badge.
So the job changed, the tools of the job changed. Did the whole philosophy change? I mean, we always hear about Bushido, the way of the warrior.
Bushido had to undergo a massive rebranding campaign. In the old days, the Warring States period, Bushido was raw and practical. It was about absolute loyalty to your lord, to the point of dying for him without a second thought. It was about facing death in battle without fear.
But in a peaceful society, that kind of...
Well, fanaticism is actually dangerous. It's a public nuisance. You don't want your top administrators getting into duels to the death over a minor insult in the middle of a crowded city. So scholars, especially scholars influenced by this philosophy called Neo-Confucianism, like a guy named Yamaka Soko, they effectively rewrote Bushido.
It shifted from being a way of dying to...
a way of living.
What does that mean in practice?
It meant that a samurai's primary duty was no longer to die gloriously, but to live honorably, to be a moral role model for the lower classes. Your loyalty was shown through hard work, through being a competent and just administrator, through self-discipline, through treating your family with respect. It became a code of conduct for a civil servant who happened to carry a sword.
So we've got these moral, educated, sword-carrying bureaucrats. They've found a new purpose, but we have to talk about the massive elephant in the room. Or maybe the rice bale in the room.
Uh-oh.
The economy.
The economics of the Edo period were, well, they were messy. Messy is putting it lightly. It was an absolute disaster for the samurai. And this is the great central paradox of the Edo period.
Yeah.
The samurai had all the social status and all the political power, but they were going broke.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. Why were they losing all their money?
It all comes down to how they were paid. The entire Japanese economy was officially based on rice. A samurai's salary wasn't paid in money, it was paid as a stipend in koku.
And one koku is?
One koku is a bale of rice, which was theoretically enough to feed one person for 1 year. So if you were a mid-level samurai, your lord might grant you a stipend of, say, 100 koku a year.
Okay, so you've got a warehouse full of rice, that's great, but you can't go to the theater and buy a ticket with a handful of rice.
You can't buy lamp oil with rice, you can't buy a new kimono with rice, you can't pay a doctor with rice. The economy, especially in the growing cities, was rapidly shifting to a cash-based system using gold, silver, and copper coins.
So the samurai had to convert their rice into cash.
They had to sell it. And who controlled the rice markets? Who were the brokers and the moneylenders?
The merchants. The very class of people they were taught to despise.
I mean, the trap is just perfect, isn't it? The samurai would have their rice shipped to a merchant broker in a city like Osaka or Edo. That merchant would sell it and give the samurai the cash, minus the hefty commission, of course.
And the merchants set the price.
The merchants controlled the exchange rates. So if there was a bumper crop one year and the country was flooded with rice, the price of rice would crash. The samurai's income, his cash income, would plummet, even though his stipend in koku was the same.
But the price of everything else wasn't going down.
It was going up. Inflation was a huge problem. So you had this nightmare scenario for the samurai, a fixed income, paid in a commodity that's losing value, while the cost of all the goods you need to buy is rising steadily. They were getting squeezed from both ends.
Meanwhile, the merchants.
The merchants were getting fabulously wealthy. They controlled the trade, they controlled the money supply. They were essentially the bankers of the era.
It's a completely upside-down world. The parasites at the bottom of the social ladder are living in luxury, and the rulers at the top are pawning their family's spare armor to buy food.
It's not an exaggeration. We have historical records of very high-ranking samurai, even some daimyo, who were catastrophically in debt to lowly merchants. Can you imagine the humiliation, having to bow your head and beg for a loan from a person you are legally allowed to cut down in the street for an insult?
It's an impossible situation, and the Shogun actually made it worse with that policy you mentioned earlier, Sankenkutai.
Ah, yes. Alternate attendance. This policy is one of the pillars of Tokugawa control. It's brilliant and cruel.
Explain it.
The shogun required every single daimyo, all 250 of them or so, to spend every other year living in the capital city of Edo.
So they're constantly moving back and forth between their home domain and the capital.
Constantly. And when the daimyo went back to his home domain for his year off, his wife and his heir had to stay behind in Edo.
As permanent hostages.
Basically, yeah. It was a guarantee of good behavior. But the real genius of the policy was economic.
How so?
A daimyo couldn't just hop on a bullet train. They had to travel in these massive ceremonial processions with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of samurai retainers. They had to look rich and powerful. The journey could take weeks and cost an absolute fortune in food, lodging, and porters.
So it was a mandatory spending spree twice a year, every year.
It was designed to keep them broke. If a daimyo was spending a huge chunk of his domain's income on travel and on maintaining a lavish second mansion in Edo, he doesn't have any money left over to buy weapons or raise an army to rebel against the shogun.
But if the daimyo is broke,
then he cuts the salaries of a samurai. So the financial pain just trickled all the way down. You ended up with this huge population of lower-ranking samurai who were living in what we would call genteel poverty. They simply could not survive on their rice stipend.
so they had to get side jobs.
They had to, which was technically illegal or at least deeply shameful for their class. They would do it secretly. They would do piecework at home.
What kind of side hustles are we talking about?
Making umbrellas from oiled paper and bamboo was a classic one. Painting paper lanterns. Weaving sandals. Making little cricket cages. Some would even raise vegetables in their tiny gardens to sell at the market.
I mean, just picture that. A trained warrior, a member of the ruling elite, sitting on his porch carefully gluing an umbrella together so he can afford to buy his kids new shoes.
It really humanizes them. They weren't just these stoic figures from movies, they were real people struggling to make ends meet, just like everyone else.
But this struggle and this long period of peace, it also led to this incredible explosion of culture and education.
We have to give the era credit for that. Because the samurai weren't fighting, they were reading and writing and thinking.
The literacy rates from this period are just shocking in a good way.
They're amazing. By the end of the period, in the mid-1800s, some estimates put the literacy rate for men as high as 40 to 50%, with a very significant percentage of women being literate too.
That's comparable to, or even higher than, many European countries at the exact same time.
It was one of the most literate societies on Earth.
How did they manage that?
Schools were everywhere. For the elite, you had hanku, which were official domain schools for samurai boys. They learned the difficult Chinese classics, Japanese history, military strategy, and calligraphy.
But it wasn't just for the samurai, right?
No, and that's the amazing part. For commoners, you had thousands of what were called terakoya, or temple schools. They were often run by a local priest or a retired samurai, and they taught basic reading, writing, and crucially, how to use the abacus for math.
So the farmers' kids and the merchants' kids were learning to read too.
Absolutely. Merchants needed it to keep their ledgers. Farmers needed it to read almanacs and village notices. It created this incredibly educated society. And when you have a lot of literate people with a little bit of disposable income,
Which was mostly the merchants.
mostly the merchants, you get this vibrant urban culture, the floating world.
Ukiyo. This is the fun stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the shogunate was officially very strict in Confucian, but the cities were buzzing. The merchants took all that money they were making and spent it on entertainment.
Like what?
Kabuki theater, which was dramatic and exciting. Sumo wrestling. Tea houses with geisha. And art.
This is where we get the famous ukiyo-e.
Pictures of the floating world. Woodblock prints. If you've ever seen Hokusai's The Great Wave off Kanagawa, that giant blue wave, that's ukiyo-e. These prints were like the posters or magazines of their day. They showed famous kabuki actors, beautiful courtesans, famous landscapes. It was pop culture.
And what about the samurai? Were they allowed to participate in this floating world?
Officially, absolutely not. Kabuki was considered loud, vulgar, and beneath a samurai's dignity. A proper samurai was supposed to be at home, practicing the quiet and refined tea ceremony, chadu, or writing a 17-syllable haiku poem, or practicing Zen meditation.
But I'm guessing they didn't always want to write poetry.
Human nature is human nature. Of course, they wanted to go see the plays and drink sake and have fun, so they would disguise themselves. They'd wear a big hat to hide their face, maybe leave their long sword at home, or hide it under a cloak, and they would sneak into the entertainment districts to enjoy themselves.
It just paints this picture of a society that's really starting to burst at the seams. You have these super strict rules, but everyone's finding ways to bend them. The economy is fundamentally broken. The class system is completely upside down in practice. It feels like a powder keg just waiting for a match.
And that match arrived in the year 1853. But it didn't come from inside Japan. It came from the ocean.
The black ships.
Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. He sails 4 massive warships right into Edo Bay, which is the doorstep of the shogun's castle. 2 of them were steam-powered, churning out black smoke from their stacks. Japanese had never seen anything like them. They look like terrifying sea monsters.
And we have to understand the context here. Japan had been almost completely closed off from the world for over 200 years. Their military technology had basically frozen in time.
Right. The samurai had swords and maybe some old-fashioned matchlock muskets from the 1600s. Perry had modern warships armed with Pixon guns. These were cannons that fired explosive shells that could level a city from miles away. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't a fight at all.
The shogun and his government must have been terrified.
It was a complete and total psychological shock. The shogun's entire reason for being, his very title, translates to great general who subdues the barbarians. That's his job, and here come the so-called barbarians with technology he can't possibly fight, and he's powerless to make them leave.
And Perry's demand was simple. Open Japan's ports to American trade, or else. This made the shogunate look weak.
Incredibly weak. Fatally weak, in fact. And this is where the samurai class itself splits apart. You have these young, educated, and often poor radical samurai, mostly from domains far away from Edo, like Satsuma and Chushu, who looked at the shogun's response and said, "This government is failing. They're going to let us be colonized by the West. We have to do something.
So they decided to overthrow their own boss, the Shogun.
Exactly. They rallied around an old symbol, the emperor. Remember the figurehead in Kyoto? They used him as the symbolic leader for a new, stronger Japan.
Right.
Their slogan was Sonishus, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians.
And this led to a civil war.
It did. The Boshin War. It was relatively short but very bloody, and it was samurai fighting samurai. You had the forces loyal to the shogun against the forces fighting for the emperor. But the imperial side adopted modern Western technology much faster. They bought rifles and cannons from the British and the Americans.
A samurai with a sword doesn't stand a chance against a line of soldiers with rifles.
Not at all. And in 1868, the shogunate fell. The last shogun abdicated, and the young Emperor Meiji was restored to power. This is the famous Meiji Restoration.
But here's the tragic, beautiful irony for the samurai. The entire revolution was led by them. But once they won and they set up this new Meiji government, they looked around and realized something very difficult.
What was that?
To build a modern nation, a nation that could compete with Britain or America or Germany, you can't have a privileged, hereditary class of warriors walking around with 2 swords and getting paid in rice. The very thing they were was now obsolete. So in order to save Japan, they had to abolish their own class.
They systematically dismantled it, piece by piece. First, they replaced the samurai armies with a modern national conscript army. They started drafting farmers' sons and merchants' sons and gave them rifles.
Which proved that a peasant with a modern rifle is just as effective as a noble samurai with a sword.
Even more so. Then they cut the stipends. No more free rice payments. They offered the samurai government bonds instead, but they were worth a tiny fraction of their old income. Overnight, the entire class was forced to find work to make a living.
And the culture, the look, the top knot.
All gone. In 1871, the government issued the Danpachire Edict, which encouraged men to cut off their samurai top knots, the Shanmai, and adopt Western hairstyles. And then the final blow in 1876, the Heitere Edict. It was made illegal to wear swords in public.
That must have been devastating. The sword wasn't just a weapon, it was their identity.
It was their soul. It was an identity crisis on a national scale. Imagine telling a Texas cowboy he's no longer allowed to wear a hat or ride a horse. Of course, there were rebellions. The most famous was the Satsuma Rebellion, led by a man named Saigo Takamori, often called the Last Samurai. But he and his traditionally armed followers were mowed down by the new imperial army and their machine guns. The era was over.
So the class was officially abolished, but the people didn't just disappear. What is the legacy here? What happened to all these samurai?
This is the most important part to understand about how modern Japan was formed. The samurai didn't vanish. They pivoted one last time. Remember, for 250 years, they had been the most educated, most literate, most administratively experienced group of people in the entire country.
So where did all that talent go?
They became the architects of modern Japan. They became the first generation of school teachers in the new public education system. They became government officials, army officers, and police chiefs. And amazingly, many of them went into business. The founders of some of Japan's greatest modern corporations, like Mitsubishi, came from samurai families.
So they took that disciplined Bushido spirit, that focus on loyalty and hard work, and just applied it to the boardroom instead of the battlefield.
Exactly. The code just shifted. Loyalty to the Lord became loyalty to the company or loyalty to the nation. If you look at the famous Japanese work ethic, or the structure of their education system, or the intense emphasis on social order and the group over the individual, that is the DNA of the Edo Period samurai bureaucracy, still alive today.
So, in a strange way, the samurai ultimately succeeded. They built a system of peace that was so stable it lasted for centuries. And when it finally broke, they were the only ones with the skills to build a new one in its place.
That's the ultimate lesson, I think. Adaptation. The samurai started as warriors, they were forced to become bureaucrats, and they ended up as the founders of a modern superpower.
Here's a final thought for everyone listening. We often tend to romanticize the fighting part of history, the big battles, the generals, the wars. But what the Edo period in Japan teaches us is that peace is actually much, much harder work. It's more complicated. It takes complex systems and difficult compromises. And sometimes it requires an entire class of people to completely reinvent who they are.
Well said. It proves that it's not about the sword you carry, it's about the mind you cultivate.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep learning.